Brace yourself for the sheer terror I'm about to share. I don't even know if this is the right place for a story like this, but I have to put it out there. I've told my family, my neighbors, my friends, hell, even news outlets. But no matter how many times I tell it, it's never enough. I feel this overwhelming need to warn as many people as possible about what's been happening to me. So here goes. It's November 2019 as I write this, but my story goes back years, over 7 at least. I can't remember the exact date, but it was somewhere around 2012, maybe 2013. Back then, I was in my mid-20s, working a stable job, and living with my girlfriend, who's now my fiancée. I never went to college, so I had been in the workforce for a while, and my life was pretty steady. Since there was no reason to move far from home, I didn't. My girlfriend and I had just moved into my childhood home, an old brick house that had been in my family for generations. My father inherited it from his parents, and now it was mine. It had been renovated a few times, but the aged brick still gave it a distinct, almost eerie presence in our neighborhood. We lived in a secluded wooded area, where houses were spaced far apart. Ours was the last lot on the street, meaning it bordered the dense forest on 2 sides. The woods were massive, so vast that even after years of exploring them as a kid, my brothers and I never came close to mapping them out. Some might find that unsettling, but I always loved the wilderness. Isolation never bothered me. If anything, it was part of the charm. Then, everything changed. It was winter, early in the season. Snow blanketed the ground. I remember it was a Sunday morning, sometime after 8 a.m., the one day a week I got to sleep in. As I stepped outside to grab my usual Sunday coffee, something caught my eye near my truck. Footprints. At first, I assumed they were my girlfriend's, but as I followed the trail, I realized that was impossible. The prints didn't lead to the house or any of the windows. Instead, they came directly from the woods, stopped at the driver's side door of my truck, then turned back toward the forest. It was unsettling, but I chalked it up to some random person wandering through. Then, 2 years later, it happened again. It was 2015. I remember because my Seahawks lost the Super Bowl to Tom Brady. I stepped outside one morning and immediately felt something was wrong. Footprints, but not just one trail, hundreds of them. They covered the yard, surrounding the house, circling the windows, leading up to the doors. Whoever, or whatever, had been there had spent a significant amount of time on my property. I wasn't panicked, but I wasn't calm either. I had to get to work, so I did a quick sweep of the yard to make sure no one was hiding nearby. Then, before leaving, I texted my girlfriend so she wouldn't freak out if she noticed the prints. By the time I got home, she had made a chilling discovery. The footprints weren't normal. They had no shoe marks. Someone had been walking barefoot, in the snow, in sub-zero temperatures. I had no explanation. My girlfriend suggested maybe it was an animal, but no, these were distinctly human footprints. I called my father, who had lived in this house for decades, but he swore nothing like this had ever happened before. He told me to grab my rifle and track the prints, but I hesitated. My girlfriend wanted to call the police, but I knew they wouldn't take it seriously. Trespassing in the middle of nowhere wouldn't warrant much of a response, so against my better judgment, I went into the woods alone. I followed the trail for about 30 minutes before something strange happened. The track split into 2 different paths. That shouldn't have been possible. Either there were 2 people or someone had doubled back to confuse me. My mind raced with disturbing possibilities. Had I been following more than one person this whole time? Had someone deliberately tried to throw me off? My stomach twisted at the thought of being outnumbered in the dense forest. I turned back. That night, we called the police, but as expected, they couldn't do much. There was no crime, no direct threat, just footprints. A snowstorm covered the tracks the next morning, and with no trail to follow, there was nothing left to investigate. For years, things were quiet. My fiancé and I got engaged, focused on our lives, and gradually let those memories fade. Then, less than a year ago, it started again. One morning after New Year's, I stepped outside and found footprints all over my property. The moment I saw them, every horrible memory came rushing back. My fiancé broke down, asking if we'd ever escape this nightmare. But this time, it was worse. The prints led to my shed and several tools were missing. That meant whoever had been on our property wasn't just watching anymore. They were taking things. I had enough. I called my friend Theo, an experienced hunter, and asked for his help. He had a thermal scope for his AR-10, which would allow him to see heat signatures even in low visibility. That night, we set out into the woods. For nearly an hour, we followed the footprints, but the deeper we went, the stranger things became. Trails would suddenly stop, forcing us to retrace our steps. It was as if someone, or something, was deliberately trying to throw us off. Then, as darkness set in, Theo stopped suddenly. He raised his rifle and stared through the thermal scope. I watched his hands tremble as he motioned for me to take a look. Through the scope, I saw 4 figures crouched in the snow. At first, I thought they were animals, but then I realized these were people. They were completely naked, huddled around something, their bodies twisted and unnatural. 2 were smaller, clinging to a tree, their heads jerking unnaturally, and they were eating something. A sick feeling washed over me. I couldn't see their faces, but I knew they weren't normal. Then, the larger ones lifted the smaller ones onto their backs and disappeared into the woods. Theo and I sat in silence for what felt like an eternity before we finally moved. By the time we returned home, my fiancée was still awake, desperate for answers. We told her what we saw, but even saying it out loud felt insane. The police did a half-hearted search the next morning, but, as expected, they found nothing. Winter is coming again, and we're terrified. We don't know if those people, those things, will come back. We've thought about moving, but nothing has been set in motion yet. And I keep asking myself, why us? Why our house? None of our neighbors have experienced anything like this. Some say it's nothing to worry about. Others tell me I'm in grave danger. I just know one thing, I don't feel safe here anymore. Last summer, I set out to conquer a major section of the Pacific Crest Trail. Solo hiking had always been my passion. The solitude, the challenge, the immersion in nature. My plan was simple: park my car at the end of the section, hitch a ride to the trailhead, and hike back over the course of about 10 days. At the time, it seemed straightforward enough. The first few days were exactly what I had hoped for. Towering trees, winding paths, and landscapes that seemed untouched by time. I kept a steady pace, stopping only when necessary, and every night, I set up my tent a short distance off the trail to avoid unwanted attention. It was a habit I'd developed over years of solo hiking. Better to be out of sight than to risk a chance encounter with a stranger in the middle of nowhere. Everything was fine, until the 3rd night. I woke up abruptly with a deep, unsettling feeling that something was wrong. It wasn't a sound or a movement, just an inexplicable gut instinct. My tent was still zipped shut. Everything inside appeared normal. I grabbed my flashlight and my rifle before stepping outside to scan the area. Nothing, not a single disturbance in the stillness of the forest. Reluctantly, I went back into my tent. That's when I noticed my wallet was missing. At first, I thought I had misplaced it, maybe left it outside, maybe shoved it deep in my pack. But after tearing through every pocket and compartment, the realization set in. Someone had taken it. My cash, credit cards, and ID, gone. The strange part? Nothing else was missing. Whoever had done this had been precise, calculated. Trying to convince myself I had somehow lost it, I pressed on. But over the next few days, small things began disappearing. My lighter, a Swiss Army knife, a few energy bars. It was subtle at first, but by the 4th day I knew without a doubt I was being stalked. I had no way to call for help, no cell service, no easy way out. Turning back would take just as long as moving forward. And every night, I lay in my tent, rifle in hand, heart pounding at the slightest sound outside. The worst part? Whoever was watching me wasn't taking my gun, as if they wanted me to keep it, as if they wanted me to feel helpless despite having it. I started tying my tent shut from the inside, hoping it would deter whoever was lurking in the darkness. Sleep became a luxury I could barely afford, and my mind began to suffer. Shadows seemed to dart just beyond my vision. Rustling leaves became whispers in the night. Then came the hallucinations. The most vivid one still haunts me. I was hiking, exhausted, when I suddenly stepped into an ice-cold puddle. My foot sank, and I nearly tripped. I heard the splash. I felt my socks soak through. But when I looked down, the ground was dry. Not a single drop of water. My mind was unraveling. Then the footsteps came. The last night before I reached my car, I woke up to slow, deliberate footsteps circling my tent. My blood ran cold. My grip tightened around my rifle, but I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I could only listen. Then, just as suddenly as they had appeared, they faded back into the trees. I had reached my breaking point. I packed up in a frenzy, hands shaking, body aching, mind screaming at me to move. I pushed forward without stopping, determined to reach my car before nightfall. But I was still hours away when darkness fell, and I had no choice but to keep going. That's when I heard it. Footsteps. behind me, close. I spun around, flashlight in one hand, rifle in the other. The beam of light caught something slipping behind a tree. My heart pounded as I aimed, voice steady despite the terror inside me. "Come out, now." A figure stepped forward. It was a man, but not like any man I had ever seen. He was wearing nothing but a pair of shorts. My shorts, which I hadn't even realized were missing. His skin was scratched and filthy, his face obscured by a tangled mess of hair. He stared at me with wide, unblinking eyes before taking a step forward. I fired a warning shot into the dirt beside him. He flinched, then bolted into the trees, disappearing into the darkness. I didn't wait to see if he'd come back. I ran, faster than I ever had before. When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and called the police. They told me to leave immediately. I didn't need to be told twice. To this day, I still don't know who or what that man was. The hallucinations still disturb me the most. I didn't think the mind could play such vivid tricks, but out there, in the isolation of the wild, reality became something else entirely. It's going to be a long time before I go hiking again, and when I do, I won't be alone. I apologize in advance if I don't get every detail perfect, but this is a story that has stuck with me for years. A close friend told me about it multiple times, and no matter how often I heard it, it never lost its disturbing grip on me. His father was a logger. Specifically, he operated a massive tree-cutting saw, one capable of bringing down towering trees and slicing them into precise lengths. His job required him to work grueling hours, often alone, deep in the remote forests of the Pacific Northwest. The way his logging crew functioned, his pay depended on the number of trees he cut rather than the hours he worked. This meant he would regularly push himself through 16 to 20-hour days to finish the job as quickly as possible. Half of his time was spent working solo, and the other half was with his partner, Griffin, another tree saw operator. They used radios to stay in touch, especially when working on opposite sides of the same job site. A few years ago, they were assigned to a particularly isolated logging site high up on a mountain. It had taken the company over 3 weeks just to clear a path wide enough for their trucks and equipment. By the time the actual logging began, they were in one of the most remote places imaginable. For the first 10 days, everything went smoothly, until the strange voices started coming through their radios. At first, it was just faint, muffled murmurs distorted by static, making it impossible to make out the words. They figured it was just interference and switched channels, but no matter what frequency they changed to, the voices followed them. Anyone familiar with standard radio systems knows how bizarre that is. It shouldn't be possible. As they worked further up the mountain, the voices became clearer. They still couldn't make out full conversations, but the snippets they caught were oddly casual, yet something about them felt off. My friend's father described the tone as eerily normal, as if two people were having a routine discussion, but the context was unintelligible, and that made it worse. Then they started finding signs that someone else had been there. Footprints in the dirt, scattered trash, remnants of small campsites. They were in such an isolated part of the wilderness that the idea of anyone else being out there was unsettling, to say the least. One day, Griffin stumbled upon something chilling, a tent tucked just off the trail. He called my friend's father over, and together they cautiously investigated. Inside, they found a single sleeping bag and a duffel bag filled with disturbing items, several pairs of small children's underwear, duct tape, rope, and crude drawings of children in horrific situations. Among the belongings was a fresh apple, still untouched, suggesting whoever owned this tent had been there recently. Griffin wanted to leave immediately, but my friend's father, ever the workaholic, insisted they stay and finish the job. They agreed to limit their radio use to emergencies only and pressed on, though an unshakable dread hung over them. That night, as they sat in their camper, the radio crackled to life again. This time, they could hear the voices more clearly. Two men were speaking, discussing mundane tasks like gathering water and firewood, but knowing these voices likely belonged to whoever had left that tent chilled them to the bone. The next night, my friend's father made a decision. When the voices returned, he grabbed the radio and demanded to know who they were and what they were doing out there. Silence. Complete and total silence. That was somehow worse than the voices. Griffin was furious that my friend's father had given away their presence. They argued briefly, but ultimately there wasn't much they could do. The job had to be finished. Then, around midnight, Griffin shook my friend's father awake. "Someone's outside," he whispered. A chill ran down his spine. Sure enough, soft footsteps crunched on the gravel just outside. Heart pounding, he fumbled for his gun, only to realize it wasn't loaded. Griffin, unarmed, sat frozen beside him. Calling for help was useless. They were hours from the nearest town. Then the camper door handle began to jiggle. The door creaked slightly open but didn't swing inward. Their camper sat high off the ground, with no ladder or step beneath it. That meant whoever was out there had to be tall. Then came a sound that made their blood run cold. Long, deliberate scratches against the door. Minutes passed like hours. Finally, my friend's father nodded at Griffin, signaling he was going to check it out. Clutching a flashlight in his trembling hands, he crept toward the door. Just as he reached for it, it burst open. A figure lunged at him, slashing across his face with a knife. The pain was instant and blinding. He tumbled backward, hitting the ground hard. Before he could react, the attacker was on him, pressing the blade against his throat. Another figure emerged from the darkness, kicking him repeatedly in the head. Griffin didn't hesitate. He leaped out of the camper and tackled the man with the knife. The second attacker bolted into the woods, and the one Griffin had pinned quickly scrambled to his feet and followed. Within seconds, they both vanished into the trees. Griffin helped my friend's father back into the truck, and they drove, bleeding, battered, and in shock for 2 straight hours to the nearest hospital. His injuries were severe. The knife had cut so deeply across his eye that it permanently damaged his vision. They reported the attack to the police, but there were no leads, no suspects, no arrests. 2 weeks later, the rest of the logging crew arrived to finish the job. That's when they found something even worse. A coworker, bound, gagged, and brutally murdered, left in a ditch near the worksite. To this day, no one was ever caught. My friend's father still struggles with the trauma of that night. His damaged eye, with its warped pupil, is a permanent reminder of what happened deep in those woods. I haven't spoken to my friend or his father in years, but I can only hope they're doing all right. As for me, I stay far, far away from the deep woods. Some things aren't worth the risk.